London in 1830, a comprehensive portrait of a city in transition. A complete history. Chapter 1. The Political Landscape and Governance of London. A city at the crossroads of change. The year 1830 marked a pivotal moment in London's long and storied history. As the capital of the world's most powerful empire, London stood as the beating heart of British commerce, politics, and culture. Yet beneath the veneer of imperial grandeur, the city seethed with political tension, social unrest, and the stirrings of reform that would reshape British society for generations to come. King George IV sat upon the throne at the beginning of 1830, though his reign would end on June 26 of that year when he died at Windsor Castle. His brother William IV would ascend to succeed him, ushering in a new era that would culminate in the Great Reform Act of 1832. The political atmosphere in London during 1830 was charged with anticipation and anxiety in equal measure. The Duke of Wellington, the hero of Waterloo, served as Prime Minister at the start of the year. Wellington represented the old Tory establishment, resistant to the sweeping changes that reformers demanded. His government faced mounting pressure from various quarters. The working classes demanded political representation. The middle classes sought acknowledgement of their growing economic power through parliamentary reform. The radical press, despite government attempts at suppression, continued to circulate ideas that challenged the established order. The structure of London's governance. London in 1830 lacked the unified municipal government that modern observers might expect for such a great metropolis. Instead, the city operated under a complex patchwork of overlapping authorities and ancient jurisdictions. The City of London proper, that square mile at the heart of the metropolis, maintained its ancient privileges under the Lord Mayor and the Court of Aldermen. This medieval system of governance continued to function much as it had for centuries, with livery companies wielding significant influence over trade and commerce. Beyond the city's boundaries, the rapidly growing areas of Westminster, Southwark, and the numerous parishes that comprised Greater London fell under different jurisdictions entirely. Parish vestries managed local affairs with varying degrees of competence and corruption. The system was inefficient, uncoordinated, and frequently inadequate to address the needs of a rapidly expanding population. Parliament met at Westminster, though not yet in the iconic Gothic Revival building that would later define the British political landscape. The old Palace of Westminster, with its cramped chambers and medieval layout, hosted the deliberations that shaped the empire's destiny. Members of Parliament arrived by carriage through streets crowded with petitioners, protesters, and the ever-present London poor who clustered around the centers of power. Political unrest and reform movements. The demand for parliamentary reform dominated political discourse in 1830. The existing electoral system was widely recognized as corrupt and unrepresentative. Rotten boroughs, constituencies with tiny populations controlled by wealthy patrons, sent members to Parliament, while great industrial cities like Manchester and Birmingham had no representation whatsoever. London itself, with its massive population, was significantly underrepresented compared to its economic and demographic weight. Working-class movements organized and agitated for change. The memory of Peterloo, the massacre of peaceful protesters in Manchester 11 years earlier, remained fresh in public consciousness. Trade unions, though technically illegal under the Combination Acts until their partial repeal in 1824, continued to organize workers and advocate for their interests. The fear of revolution, inspired by events in France and elsewhere on the continent, haunted the nightmares of the propertied classes. Radical publications circulated through coffeehouses, taverns, and reading rooms. William Cobbett's Political Register reached working-class readers with its attacks on corruption and privilege. The unstamped press, publications that evaded the newspaper tax designed to limit their circulation, spread ideas of reform and rights among the literate poor. The government responded with prosecutions and suppression, but the tide of opinion proved impossible to stem. The Metropolitan Police. One significant development had occurred just the year before, in 1829, with the establishment of the Metropolitan Police under Sir Robert Peel's guidance. Before this innovation, London's law enforcement had consisted of an antiquated system of parish watchmen, Bow Street runners, and various private initiatives. The new police force, with its distinctive blue uniforms and top hats, represented a revolutionary approach to maintaining public order. The peelers, or bobbies, as they came to be known, patrolled the streets of the metropolis in their first full year of operation during 1830. Their presence was not universally welcomed. Many Londoners viewed the police with suspicion, seeing them as instruments of government oppression rather than protectors of public safety. Working-class communities, accustomed to handling their own affairs and deeply distrustful of authority, often greeted the new constables with hostility. Nevertheless, the Metropolitan Police represented a decisive step toward modern urban governance. Their beat system, their professional training, and their centralized command structure would eventually become the model for police forces throughout the world. In 1830, however, they remained a controversial experiment, their future success far from assured. Chapter 2: The Physical City and Its Architecture. The Transformation of London's Landscape. The London of 1830 was a city in the midst of dramatic physical transformation. The Regency era, named for the period when the future George IV served as Prince Regent for his incapacitated father, had witnessed an unprecedented building boom that reshaped the face of the metropolis. Grand terraces, elegant squares, and ambitious urban planning schemes had created new neighborhoods of unprecedented elegance, while the ancient medieval street pattern of the older city remained largely unchanged. John Nash's ambitious schemes for Regent Street and Regent's Park represented the most visible achievements of this era of improvement. Regent Street, completed in the mid-1820s, carved a grand processional route from Carlton House to the park, creating a boundary between the fashionable West End and the less respectable districts of Soho. The sweeping curve of the quadrant, with its cast-iron colonnades, demonstrated the possibilities of unified urban design on a scale previously unknown in London. Regent's Park itself, opened to the public in 1828, offered a new model for urban recreation. Nash's terraces surrounding the park presented palatial facades that disguised rows of individual townhouses, creating an illusion of aristocratic grandeur accessible to the prosperous middle classes. The park's landscaped grounds, with their serpentine paths and picturesque views, brought the ideals of the English landscape garden into the heart of the expanding city. The West End and East End divide. The contrast between different areas of London in 1830 could hardly have been more stark. The West End, with its grand squares and elegant streets, housed the aristocracy and the wealthy during the London season. Mayfair, Belgravia, and the areas around St. James's Palace represented the pinnacle of fashionable residence. Here, magnificent townhouses displayed the wealth and taste of their owners through classical facades, imposing porticos, and carefully maintained gardens. The squares of the West End, Grosvenor Square, Berkeley Square, and their neighbors, provided green refuges amid the urban landscape. These private gardens, accessible only to the residents of surrounding properties, represented exclusive amenities unavailable to ordinary Londoners. The uniformity of architectural style, enforced by ground landlords like the Grosvenor family, created streetscapes of remarkable coherence and elegance. In stark contrast, the East End presented a very different picture. The areas around the docks, in Wapping, Shadwell, and Limehouse, teemed with sailors, dock workers, and the myriad trades that supported maritime commerce. Streets were narrow, buildings crowded together, and the population density far exceeded anything in the fashionable West. The smell of the river, the tar and timber of shipyards, and the exotic cargoes from around the world created a sensory environment utterly distinct from the perfumed drawing rooms of Mayfair. Bridges, and the River Thames. The River Thames remained the great artery of London's commerce, and a defining feature of its geography. In 1830, several bridges spanned the river within the metropolitan area, though far fewer than today. London Bridge, rebuilt in stone between 1825 and 1831, was in the final stages of its reconstruction during this period. The new bridge, designed by John Rennie and completed by his son, replaced the medieval structure that had stood for over 6 centuries. Westminster Bridge, Blackfriars Bridge, and Waterloo Bridge provided additional crossings. Waterloo Bridge, opened in 1817, was considered one of the finest achievements of engineering and architecture in the city. Vauxhall Bridge, opened in 1816, served the southern approaches. Southwark Bridge, completed in 1819, connected the city with the South Bank. Each bridge collected tolls from those who crossed, and the fee structures created significant barriers for the poor. Below the bridges, the Thames teemed with traffic. Wherries and ferries carried passengers across the water. Lighters and barges transported goods from the great ships moored in the Pool of London to the wharves and warehouses along the banks. The river was London's highway, its commercial lifeline, and its sewer. The water was already heavily polluted by 1830, carrying the effluent of the growing city toward the sea. Churches, public buildings, and monuments. The skyline of London in 1830 remained dominated by the Great Dome of St. Paul's Cathedral, Christopher Wren's masterpiece completed in 1710. No other structure challenged its preeminence, as building height restrictions and the technology of the era prevented the construction of anything comparable. The church spires that had once defined the city's silhouette had been reduced by the Great Fire of 1666, but Wren's rebuilt churches continued to punctuate the cityscape. The great classical public buildings that would later define Victorian London were not yet constructed in 1830. The British Museum, though established as an institution in 1753, still occupied Montague House, rather than the grand colonnaded building that Robert Smirke was then designing. The National Gallery would not be built until the mid-1830s. The Houses of Parliament remained in their medieval form, the Great Fire that would destroy them still 4 years in the future. Somerset House, completed in the late 18th century, represented the most significant classical public building of the era. Its grand riverside facade and courtyard demonstrated the ambitions of Georgian public architecture. The Royal Academy, one of the building's prestigious tenants, hosted exhibitions that drew fashionable crowds each year. Chapter 3: Social Classes and Daily Life. The aristocracy and upper classes. The social hierarchy of London in 1830 was rigid, elaborate, and pervasive in its influence on every aspect of daily life. At the apex of this pyramid stood the aristocracy, the titled nobility, whose wealth derived primarily from their vast landed estates throughout the country. These families maintained magnificent townhouses in London's most fashionable districts, where they resided during the parliamentary session and the social season. The London season, running roughly from Easter through July, brought the aristocracy together for an annual round of balls, dinners, opera performances, and social occasions. Young ladies were presented at court, making their debuts into society under the watchful eyes of ambitious mothers determined to secure advantageous marriages. The elaborate rituals of calling, leaving cards, and maintaining proper social connections occupied enormous amounts of time and energy. For aristocratic gentlemen, the day might begin late after the previous evening's entertainments. Morning calls, despite their name, typically occurred in the early afternoon. Afternoons might be spent at one's club, White's, or Brooks's, or the Carlton, where political gossip mingled with gambling and drinking. The evening brought dinner parties, theater visits, or attendance at balls that continued until the early morning hours. Ladies of the upper classes faced their own demanding schedule. Morning hours might be devoted to correspondence, household management conducted through servants, or receiving visitors. Afternoon drives in Hyde Park during the fashionable hour, roughly between 5 and 7, provided opportunities for display and social interaction. Evening entertainments required elaborate toilettes and the donning of costly gowns, jewels, and accessories. The middle classes. Below the aristocracy, the middle classes of London in 1830 comprised a diverse group, united by their separation from both the privileges of the titled and the manual labor of the poor. Merchants, bankers, lawyers, physicians, and the emerging class of industrialists formed the upper ranks of this bourgeoisie. Shopkeepers, clerks, schoolteachers, and minor professionals occupied the lower rungs. The middle-class home represented a carefully maintained sanctuary of respectability. Domestic servants, even if only a single maid of all work, marked the boundary between middle-class status and the laboring poor. The furnishings, decorations, and routines of the household proclaimed the family's claim to gentility. Dinner in the early evening, rather than at midday like the working classes, signified middle-class aspirations. For middle-class men, the world of work defined daily life. The counting house, the shop, the office, or the professional chambers occupied the daylight hours. Commuting across the city had not yet become common. Most men of business lived near their places of work or maintained separate residences in commercial districts. The separation of home and workplace, which would become characteristic of Victorian middle-class life, remained incomplete in 1830. Middle-class women increasingly occupied a domestic sphere defined by ideals of refinement and moral influence. The education of daughters emphasized accomplishments such as music, drawing, and French rather than academic subjects. Yet the practical skills of household management remained essential, as the mistress of a modest establishment often supervised operations with far fewer servants than her aristocratic counterparts. The working classes and the poor. The vast majority of London's population in 1830 belonged to the working classes and the poor. Skilled artisans, journeymen in various trades, domestic servants, and laborers of every description made up this enormous mass of humanity. Their lives bore little resemblance to the elegant existence of the upper orders. The working day for laborers typically began at 6 in the morning and continued until 8 or 9 at night, with brief breaks for meals. 12 to 14-hour days were common, and 6-day weeks were standard. Only Sunday provided respite, and even then, many continued in necessary occupations. The concept of leisure time as we understand it simply did not exist for most workers. Housing for the working classes ranged from merely crowded to appallingly squalid. Multiple families might share a single room, with beds used in shifts. Cellar dwellings, dark and damp, housed the poorest. Sanitary facilities were primitive at best, often consisting of a single privy shared by an entire building or court. Running water was unavailable to most, requiring laborious trips to communal pumps or water carts. The diet of the working poor was monotonous and often inadequate. Bread formed the staple, supplemented by potatoes, cheese, and occasional meat. Adulteration of food was rampant, with bakers adding chalk to flour, brewers using various adulterants in beer, and coffee being stretched with chicory, or worse. Malnutrition weakened immune systems and made the population vulnerable to the epidemic diseases that regularly swept through crowded neighborhoods. Children and family life. Childhood in London in 1830 varied enormously according to social class. Children of the wealthy grew up in nurseries and schoolrooms, tended by nurses, governesses, and tutors. Their contact with parents might be limited to formal occasions, though the emerging ideals of the affectionate family were beginning to change these patterns. Education for upper-class boys led to public schools and possibly university. Girls received instruction in domestic accomplishments and social graces. For children of the poor, childhood as a protected period of development and play scarcely existed. Children as young as 5 or 6 worked in various capacities. Climbing boys swept chimneys, their small bodies forced up narrow flues. Factory children tended machines and performed tasks requiring small fingers. Street children sold newspapers, held horses, swept crossings, or begged. The Foundling Hospital, established by Thomas Coram in the previous century, cared for some abandoned infants, but countless others perished in the streets or in workhouses. Education for the poor remained limited and haphazard. Charity schools provided basic literacy for some. Sunday schools offered religious instruction and rudimentary reading skills, but formal education remained inaccessible to the majority of working-class children, who were needed for labor from an early age. Chapter 4: Economy, Trade, and Industry. London as commercial capital. London in 1830 functioned as the commercial heart of the world's most extensive empire. The City of London, that ancient square mile, contained the greatest concentration of financial power on earth. The Bank of England, Lloyd's of London, and countless private banking houses managed the capital that financed global trade. The Royal Exchange provided a meeting place for merchants conducting business that spanned continents and oceans. The city's financial institutions had weathered recent storms. The Panic of 1825, triggered by speculation in South American securities, had caused numerous bank failures and widespread distress. Recovery had been slow and incomplete, and memories of the crisis continued to influence business confidence in 1830. Nevertheless, London's position as the center of international finance remained unassailable. The Port of London represented the greatest maritime commercial hub in the world. The enclosed docks, built in the first decade of the century to combat the endemic theft that plagued riverside wharves, handled a staggering volume of trade. The West India Docks, the London Docks, the East India Docks, and the Surrey Commercial Docks received cargoes from every corner of the globe. Sugar, rum, tobacco, cotton, tea, spices, timber, and countless other commodities flowed through these facilities. The docks and maritime trade. The spectacle of the London docks in 1830 would have overwhelmed modern observers. Forests of masts crowded the basin, ships from India, China, the Americas, Africa, and Europe moored side by side. The warehouses that lined the dock walls rose to impressive heights, their brick facades concealing treasures from around the world. The smells of exotic goods mingled with the ever-present odor of the river and the tang of salt air. Dock workers formed a significant portion of London's laboring population. These men, many of them Irish immigrants, performed back-breaking labor unloading ships and moving cargo. The work was casual, meaning that workers gathered each morning hoping to be hired for that day's labor. This system created tremendous insecurity and kept wages low, as desperate men competed for limited opportunities. The trades associated with maritime commerce spread throughout the East End. Rope makers, sailmakers, ship chandlers, coopers, and countless other craftsmen provided the goods and services that kept the merchant fleet afloat. Taverns and lodging houses catered to sailors between voyages. Less savory establishments, including brothels and gambling dens, also thrived in the dock districts, manufacturing and craft industries. London in 1830 remained primarily a city of craft manufacturing rather than factory production. The great industries of the Industrial Revolution, textiles and iron, concentrated in the northern and Midland counties rather than in the capital. London's manufacturing consisted largely of small workshops producing goods for the metropolitan market and for export. The silk weavers of Spitalfields represented one of London's most significant manufacturing communities. Huguenot refugees had established the trade in previous centuries, and by 1830, thousands of looms operated in the district. The weavers faced increasing competition from mechanized factories in the north and from imports. Their desperate struggle to maintain their livelihoods and traditions would continue for decades. The building trades employed large numbers of Londoners in 1830. The construction boom of the previous decades, while slowing from its Regency peak, continued to provide work for carpenters, bricklayers, plasterers, painters, and laborers. Speculative builders transformed open fields into new neighborhoods, for better or worse, throughout the expanding suburbs. Luxury trades flourished in the West End, producing goods for the wealthy. Tailors on Savile Row created bespoke gentlemen's clothing. Coachmakers constructed the elegant vehicles that carried the aristocracy through London's streets. Jewelers, silversmiths, furniture makers, and artists of every description catered to the tastes of the affluent. These trades combined traditional craftsmanship with the latest fashions to produce goods of remarkable quality. Banking and finance. The financial sector of London in 1830 operated on principles very different from modern banking. The Bank of England, established in 1694, held a unique position as the government's banker, and as the only joint stock bank permitted within 65 miles of London. This monopoly forced other London banks to operate as private partnerships, limiting their size and stability. Private banks proliferated throughout the city, many of them operating from premises on Lombard Street and its environs. These banks accepted deposits, made loans, and handled the complex credit arrangements that facilitated commerce. The failure of any one bank could trigger panic, as depositors rushed to withdraw funds from others, fearing similar collapses. The Stock Exchange, located since 1801 in its purpose-built premises on Capel Court, provided a market for government securities and the shares of the limited number of joint stock companies permitted to exist. Trading in shares was restricted to members of the exchange, creating an exclusive club that controlled access to capital markets. The speculation that had led to the 1825 crisis had prompted some caution, but the appetite for financial risk remained strong. Insurance was a major London industry. Lloyd's of London insured ships and cargoes, spreading the risks of maritime commerce among numerous underwriters. Life insurance companies, many of them founded in the previous century, offered policies that combined protection with investment. Fire insurance offices maintained their own fire brigades, responding only to fires at insured premises and identified by their distinctive plaques. Chapter 5: Culture, Entertainment, and the Arts. Theatre and performance. The theatrical world of London in 1830 operated under the restrictive conditions of the patent system. Only two theatres, Drury Lane and Covent Garden, held royal patents permitting them to present spoken drama. These enormous venues, rebuilt after fires in the early 19th century, dominated the legitimate stage. Their size, necessary to achieve financial viability, often made intimate acting impossible and favored broad, declamatory styles. The patent theaters presented a mixed repertoire. Shakespeare remained a staple, though often performed in heavily adapted versions that would strike modern audiences as peculiar. New plays by contemporary dramatists competed with classic revivals. Melodrama, with its clear moral distinctions and spectacular effects, attracted large audiences. Edmund Kean, though past his prime by 1830, remained the greatest tragic actor of the age. The minor theaters, denied the right to present straight drama, developed creative circumventions of the patent restrictions. By adding musical accompaniment to performances, they could present what amounted to plays while technically remaining within the law. Sadler's Wells, the Adelphi, the Surrey, and numerous other venues offered entertainment that ranged from legitimate drama thinly disguised to outright sensation and spectacle. Popular entertainments catered to audiences of every class. Astley's amphitheater presented equestrian spectacles that drew enormous crowds. Puppet shows, acrobatic performances, and exhibitions of curiosities provided amusement for those with limited budgets. Pleasure gardens, though declining from their 18th century glory, still attracted visitors seeking outdoor entertainment, music, and refreshment. Music and opera. Musical life in London in 1830 centered on several institutions. The King's Theatre in the Haymarket presented Italian opera to fashionable audiences. The subscribers who occupied boxes at the opera represented the cream of London society, and attendance was as much about social display as artistic appreciation. The great singers of the Italian stage, performing works by Rossini and other composers, drew enthusiastic acclaim. English opera, distinct from the Italian variety, was presented at the patent theaters and elsewhere. These works, often adapted from continental sources, featured spoken dialogue between musical numbers. The tradition would continue to develop throughout the century, eventually leading to the operettas of Gilbert and Sullivan. Concert life was less developed than in some continental capitals, but London nonetheless offered significant opportunities for musical performance. The Philharmonic Society, founded in 1813, presented orchestral concerts of high quality. Public concerts in various venues brought instrumental and vocal music to audiences. Private musical evenings in the homes of the wealthy featured both amateur and professional performers. Church music reached its largest audience through the weekly services at countless places of worship. The cathedrals and great churches maintained choral traditions of ancient origin. Parish churches offered more modest musical fare. The singing of hymns and psalms formed an important part of religious observance for congregations of every denomination. Literature and publishing. The London of 1830 was a great center of literary production and publishing. The Romantic movement, though its greatest poets had died, or would soon die, remained influential. Wordsworth and Coleridge continued to write, though their best work lay behind them. Byron had died in Greece in 1824, Shelley had drowned in Italy in 1822, and Keats had succumbed to tuberculosis in Rome in 1821. Their works, however, remained widely read and deeply influential. The novel as a literary form was undergoing significant development. Sir Walter Scott's historical romances had established new possibilities for the genre. Jane Austen, who had died in 1817, was gaining appreciation, though her full recognition would come later. The young Charles Dickens was only 18 in 1830, his great work still in the future, but the appetite for fiction of all kinds was growing, fed by circulating libraries and an expanding reading public. Publishing and bookselling concentrated in certain areas of London. Paternoster Row, near St. Paul's Cathedral, housed numerous publishers and booksellers. The firms that dominated the trade, Longman, John Murray, and others, operated from premises that combined offices, warehouses, and often retail shops. The publication of new works was expensive, and prices kept books beyond the reach of the poor. Periodicals and newspapers provided reading matter for broader audiences. The Great Quarterlies, the Edinburgh Review, and the Quarterly Review shaped literary and political opinion among the educated. Monthly magazines offered a mix of fiction, essays, and commentary. Daily newspapers, despite heavy taxation designed to limit their circulation, reported on events in London and around the world. Visual arts and architecture. The visual arts in London in 1830 operated within institutional frameworks that would persist, with modifications, throughout the century. The Royal Academy, founded in 1768, remained the preeminent artistic institution. Its annual exhibition attracted thousands of visitors and shaped public taste. Election as a Royal Academician represented the highest official recognition available to British artists. The dominant styles in painting ranged from historical and mythological subjects to portraiture and landscape. Sir Thomas Lawrence, who died in 1830, had been the leading portrait painter of his generation. J.M.W. Turner was producing the atmospheric landscapes that would secure his reputation as one of the greatest painters of any age. John Constable, though less appreciated in his lifetime than Turner, was creating works that would influence generations of artists. Architecture in 1830 remained dominated by classical styles, though the Gothic revival was beginning to make inroads. The influence of Greek antiquity, inspired by archaeological discoveries and the Greek War of Independence, produced buildings of severe Doric and Ionic character. The work of John Nash represented a more eclectic approach, combining classical elements with picturesque sensibility. The acquisition of the Elgin marbles by the British Museum in 1816 had provided London with direct access to the greatest achievements of Greek sculpture. Artists and architects studied these works, and their influence permeated British art and design. The planned new building for the British Museum would incorporate these classical ideals in its monumental colonnade. Chapter 6: Health, Sanitation, and Living Conditions. Disease and Mortality. The health conditions in London in 1830 were, by modern standards, appalling. Life expectancy was shockingly low, particularly among the poor. Infant mortality claimed a significant proportion of all children born, and those who survived infancy faced numerous perils throughout their lives. The average life expectancy at birth in working-class districts was around 30 years, though this figure was heavily influenced by infant and child deaths. Epidemic diseases swept through London with terrifying regularity. Typhus, spread by lice in crowded and unsanitary conditions, struck the poor with particular severity. Typhoid fever, transmitted through contaminated water and food, claimed victims across all classes. Smallpox, though vaccination was becoming more common, continued to kill and disfigure. Measles, scarlet fever, and whooping cough killed thousands of children each year. The Great Cholera epidemic that would devastate London lay just 2 years in the future. In 1832, Asiatic cholera, which had been spreading westward from India, would reach Britain for the first time. The disease would kill tens of thousands and expose the inadequacy of existing public health measures. But in 1830, Londoners remained unaware of the approaching catastrophe, though reports from the continent hinted at the danger. Tuberculosis, known as consumption, was the single greatest cause of death. The disease progressed slowly, often over years, giving it a romantic association with artistic genius that obscured its horrible reality. No cure existed, and treatments ranged from the ineffective to the harmful. The disease struck across all classes, though poverty and overcrowding accelerated its spread. Medical practice and hospitals. Medical practice in 1830 remained based on theories and treatments that would soon be discredited. The germ theory of disease lay decades in the future, and physicians understood neither the causes nor the mechanisms of most illnesses. Treatments often did more harm than good. Bleeding patients to reduce supposed imbalances of bodily humors remained common practice. Powerful drugs, including mercury and opium, were prescribed with little understanding of their effects. The medical profession itself was divided into several categories. Physicians, the most prestigious practitioners, held university degrees and treated the wealthy. They diagnosed disease and prescribed treatments, but considered surgery and dispensing medications beneath their dignity. Surgeons, organized in their own professional body, performed operations and treated injuries. Apothecaries provided medications and often served as general practitioners for the middle and lower classes. Hospitals served primarily the poor, as the wealthy received care in their homes. The great London hospitals, St. Bartholomew's, St. Thomas', Guy's, and others, provided charity care and served as teaching institutions. Conditions in these hospitals were often grim, with overcrowding and cross-infection adding to patients' dangers. The wealthy avoided hospitals whenever possible, associating them with poverty and death. Childbirth remained dangerous for women of all classes. Maternal mortality rates were high, and the practice of obstetrics was undergoing changes that did not always benefit patients. Male accoucheurs increasingly replaced traditional midwives among the upper classes, introducing interventions that often caused more harm than the natural processes they interrupted. Puerperal fever, the childbed fever caused by infections transmitted by medical practitioners who did not understand the need for hygiene, killed thousands of new mothers. Water and sanitation. The water supply of London in 1830 was inadequate, unreliable, and increasingly polluted. Several private water companies competed to serve different districts of the metropolis. Their supplies came largely from the Thames and its tributaries, rivers that also received the effluent of the city's sewers. The connection between contaminated water and disease was not yet understood, but the consequences were deadly nonetheless. Water was not supplied continuously. Companies turned on their mains only for limited periods, often a few hours every other day. Residents filled cisterns and storage vessels during these periods, and the stored water often became stagnant and contaminated. The poor, unable to afford proper storage containers, suffered most from this intermittent supply. Sewerage in London remained primitive. The original purpose of sewers was to drain rainwater, not to carry human waste. Indeed, the discharge of sewage into drains was technically illegal in many parishes, though the prohibition was increasingly ignored. The alternative, cesspools in cellars and yards, created problems of their own as they overflowed or contaminated groundwater. The disposal of human waste presented ongoing challenges. The night soil men who emptied cesspools performed essential but unpleasant work, usually at night. The contents were supposed to be transported out of the city for use as agricultural fertilizer, but disposal was often haphazard. The smell of London, particularly in summer, reflected these inadequate sanitary arrangements. Housing conditions and overcrowding. The housing stock of London in 1830 varied enormously in quality and condition. The newly built terraces of the West End offered spacious and comfortable accommodation for the wealthy. Well-maintained Georgian houses provided respectable homes for the middle classes. But for the poor, housing conditions were often abysmal. The worst slums concentrated in areas like St. Giles, Seven Dials, and districts near the river. Here, ancient buildings, originally constructed as single-family homes, had been subdivided again and again to accommodate ever more tenants. Rooms were partitioned with flimsy materials. Cellars, never intended for habitation, housed families in dark, damp conditions. Multiple families might share a single room, sleeping in shifts or crowded together on straw. The rookeries, as the worst slums were known, presented scenes of degradation that shocked observers who ventured into them. Narrow courts and alleys, never touched by sunlight, accumulated refuse and filth. Buildings propped each other up, their structures rotting from within. The lack of sanitary facilities, the absence of running water, and the impossibility of maintaining cleanliness in such conditions created environments where disease flourished. Rent extraction from the poor was efficient and relentless. Landlords, often operating through layers of middlemen, subdivided and subdivided again, maximizing income while minimizing maintenance. Weekly rents consumed a significant proportion of working-class incomes, leaving little for food, clothing, or other necessities. Eviction for non-payment was swift and heartless. Chapter 7: Transportation and Communication. Streets and Street Life. The streets of London in 1830 presented a spectacle of remarkable variety and vitality. From the broad new thoroughfares of the West End to the narrow medieval lanes of the city, London's street life embodied the diversity of the metropolis. The street was not merely a channel for movement, but a space for commerce, entertainment, and social interaction of every kind. Street paving and maintenance varied enormously. The main thoroughfares were generally paved with stone or gravel and reasonably well maintained. Side streets and the courts and alleys of poorer districts might be unpaved, becoming quagmires in wet weather and dust bowls when dry. Street lighting, provided by oil lamps, left much of London in darkness after sunset. The gas lighting that was beginning to appear on major streets represented a significant improvement, but was far from universal. Street vendors of every description created a constant backdrop of commercial activity and noise. Costermongers sold fruits and vegetables from barrows. Milk sellers walked their routes with pails and measures. Street food vendors offered pies, roasted chestnuts, and various other edibles. The cries of vendors, each with their distinctive calls, formed a symphony that visitors found remarkable and residents took for granted. Street sweepers, crossing sweepers, and scavengers attempted to manage the enormous quantities of waste that accumulated. Horse manure from the thousands of horses that powered London's transportation formed a major component of this waste. The crossing sweeper, who cleared a path through the muck for pedestrians willing to pay a small tip, represented one of the humblest occupations in the metropolitan economy. Horse-powered transportation. The horse dominated transportation in London in 1830. Every form of vehicular movement depended on horsepower, creating an industry of enormous scale. The care and feeding of London's horses, the production and maintenance of vehicles, and the employment of drivers and grooms constituted a significant portion of the metropolitan economy. Private carriages represented the preferred mode of transportation for the wealthy. The finest carriages, built by craftsmen of remarkable skill, combined elegant design with comfort and durability. A gentleman's carriage, with its matched horses and liveried coachmen and footmen, proclaimed his status to all who observed its passage. Ladies of fashion displayed themselves in their carriages during the daily parade in Hyde Park. Hackney coaches, the ancestors of the modern taxi, provided hire transportation for those who could afford the fare. These vehicles, strictly regulated as to their number and fares, waited at designated stands throughout the city. The quality of hackney coaches varied considerably, and complaints about decrepit vehicles and dishonest drivers were common. The short stage coaches provided a form of public transportation within the metropolitan area. These vehicles, operating on fixed routes with published fares, carried passengers between different parts of London and its suburbs. They were often overcrowded and uncomfortable, but they provided essential transportation for the middle classes and more prosperous workers. Long-distance travel and the coaching era. Long-distance travel in 1830 remained dominated by the stagecoach, though this era was drawing to its close. The coaching network that connected London with every corner of the kingdom represented a remarkable achievement of organization and logistics. From great coaching inns like the Bull and Mouth and St. Martin's-le-Grand, coaches departed for destinations throughout Britain on regular schedules. The mail coaches, operated under contract with the post office, represented the pinnacle of coaching service. These vehicles, painted in royal scarlet and black, maintained rigorous schedules that depended on frequent changes of horses and experienced drivers. The mail coach guard, armed with a blunderbuss against highwaymen, sounded his horn to announce arrivals and departures. The journey from London to major provincial cities required many hours. Edinburgh might be reached in about 40 hours of continuous travel, a journey that tried the endurance of passengers subjected to jolting roads and cramped quarters. Coaching inns along the routes provided meals and overnight accommodation for those whose journeys required breaks. The railway age was about to transform all of this. The Liverpool and Manchester Railway had opened just months before, in September 1830, demonstrating the potential of steam-powered transportation. Within a decade, railway lines would radiate from London, and the coaching era would end. But in 1830, the stagecoach remained supreme, and few Londoners could anticipate the revolution about to overtake them. Communication and the post. Written communication in 1830 depended primarily on the postal system operated by the General Post Office. The mail coach network distributed letters throughout the kingdom with impressive efficiency. A letter posted in London might reach Manchester or Bristol within 24 hours, a remarkable achievement for the pre-railway era. Postal rates remained high, calculated by distance and by the number of sheets of paper. A single sheet letter to a distant destination might cost more than a day's wage for a laborer. These costs limited correspondence to the prosperous and to businesses for whom communication was essential. The poor, largely illiterate in any case, had little occasion to write letters. Within London, the two-penny post provided local delivery at a more affordable rate. Merchants and professional men depended on this service for the routine correspondence that business required. Multiple daily deliveries ensured that letters posted in the morning might receive replies by evening. Newspapers and periodicals circulated through the post with subsidized rates that reflected the government's recognition of their importance. Despite this subsidy and the stamp duty that newspapers paid, prices kept most publications beyond the reach of the poor. Reading rooms and coffee houses provided access to newspapers for those unable to afford their own subscriptions. Conclusion. London in 1830, a city suspended between eras. The London of 1830 stood at a pivotal moment in its long history. The city that Edmund Burke had called the metropolis of the commerce of the world was about to undergo transformations that would alter every aspect of its existence. The railway, the reformed parliament, the new police force, and countless other innovations were already in place or imminent, waiting to reshape the face of the capital. Yet much of what defined London in 1830 reached back centuries rather than forward. The street cries of vendors echoed patterns established in medieval times. The craft workshops of artisans perpetuated traditions of skill and organization that would soon be swept away by industrial production. The rigid social hierarchy that separated the lives of rich and poor retained its power, even as reformers challenged its legitimacy. The physical city itself embodied these contrasts. Nash's elegant terraces and bridges of unprecedented engineering skill demonstrated the possibilities of modern urban design. Yet the ancient rookeries and medieval street patterns persisted, resisting improvement and perpetuating conditions that threatened the health and safety of all Londoners. The population of London in 1830, approximately 1.5 million people, made it the largest city in the world. This distinction would be held for another century, as London continued to grow throughout the Victorian era. The engine of this growth was the British Empire, which funneled the commerce of the world through London's port and the wealth of nations through London's banks. Looking back from our present vantage point, we can see 1830 as a threshold moment. The Georgian era was ending. The Victorian era had not yet begun. The reforms that would modernize British politics and society were imminent but not yet achieved. The technologies that would transform transportation, communication, and industry were emerging but had not yet reached their full development. For those who lived in London in 1830, the future remained unknown. They went about their daily lives, pursuing their ambitions and struggling with their challenges, unaware of the transformations that awaited them. The coal smoke that darkened their skies, the diseases that shortened their lives, the inequalities that constrained their opportunities, all seemed permanent features of existence rather than problems that might be solved. Yet solve them they would, or at least begin to address them. The Victorian era that followed would bring public health reforms, expanded education, political democratization, and technological progress that would transform London beyond recognition. The dirty, dangerous, divided city of 1830 would become something different, though whether better or worse remains a matter of perspective. Understanding London in 1830 requires us to enter imaginatively into a world very different from our own. The sounds, the smells, the sights of that city bear little resemblance to the London of today, yet continuities persist beneath the surface of change. The street patterns of the ancient city, the course of the Thames, the basic geography of the metropolis remain recognizable. And human nature, with its mixture of ambition and compassion, cruelty and kindness, remains constant across the centuries. The London of 1830 was, in the end, a human city, filled with human beings living human lives. Their joys and sorrows, their triumphs and failures, their hopes and fears, resonate across the centuries that separate us from them. In studying their world, we come to understand both the distance that separates us from the past and the connections that bind us to those who came before.